In the year 253 after Aegon's conquest, Casterly Rock stood as it had for thousands of years, a mountain carved into a fortress, the seat of the richest house in all the 7 kingdoms. Yet wealth alone does not command respect, and gold cannot purchase fear. The Lannisters learned this bitter truth during the reign of Lord Tywin Lannister, a man whose kindness became cruelty, whose mercy became weakness, and whose laughter echoed through halls that should have trembled with authority. Tywin Lannister was not an evil man. That was perhaps his greatest failing. In a realm built on iron and blood, on the sharp edge of power and the cold certainty of consequences, Tywin offered gentleness. He forgave debts that should have been collected in flesh and coin. He laughed at insults that should have been answered with steel. He trusted when he should have suspected, and he loved when he should have calculated. His vassals did not respect him. His neighbours did not fear him. And his son, his brilliant golden-haired son Tywin, watched every humiliation with eyes that learned to see the world as it truly was, not as his father wished it to be. The Western lords had ruled their domains for centuries beneath the Lannister banner. Paying homage to Casterly Rock as lesser predators defer to the alpha of the pride. House Reyne of Castamere and House Tarbeck of Tarbeck Hall stood among the most powerful of these vassals, proud and ancient in their own right. The Reynes, with their red lion sigil, claimed descent from the age of heroes. The Tarbecks held strong keeps in the hills and commanded respect through martial prowess. Under a strong lord of Casterly Rock, they bent the knee and paid their taxes. Under Tywin, they began to wonder why they bothered. It started small, as these things always do. A late payment here, a forgotten courtesy there. Lord Walderan Tarbeck borrowing gold for a daughter's dowry and delaying repayment. Roger Reyne, called the Red Lion, riding through Lannisport with a retinue that numbered more men than protocol allowed, laughing when the portmaster dared not challenge him. These were tests, small violations of the social order that measured the strength of the hand that should have crushed them. Titus's hand trembled with kindness and opened with forgiveness. The violations grew bolder. The true humiliation, the wound that would never fully heal, came in the form of a woman. Ellen Reyne, the wife of the Red Lion himself, possessed beauty that poets praised, and a cunning that they did not. She caught the eye of Tywin Lannister after his own wife's death, and what began as courtly flirtation became an open affair that scandalized the Westerlands. A lord dallying with a vassal's wife was hardly unprecedented in Westeros. Bastards dotted every family tree, and desire respected no marriage vows. But the manner of it, the brazen nature of Titus's infatuation, the way he showered Ellen with gifts from the Lannister treasury, while her husband laughed and accepted the implicit payment for his wife's company, this transformed personal weakness into political disaster. Young Tywin Lannister, barely more than a boy, but already possessed of a mind that calculated costs and consequences, watched his father become a figure of mockery. In the great hall of Casterly Rock, visiting lords would exchange knowing glances when Ellen Reyne entered Tywin's arm. In the training yards, squires whispered jokes about the lion who let a she-wolf into his den, though the Reynes bore a lion sigil of their own, and the joke worked on multiple levels. The masters in the rookery spoke carefully around the young heir, but Tywin heard the servants, saw the smirks, and felt the shame like acid in his throat. The affair ended eventually, as such things do. Ellen Reyne grew bored, or perhaps had extracted sufficient wealth and favour. She returned to Castamere and her husband, leaving Tytos with empty coffers and a reputation in tatters. But the damage extended far beyond lost gold or wounded pride. Every vassal lord who witnessed Tytos's weakness drew the same conclusion. The Lion of Lannister had no teeth. The time had come to test just how much they could take. The debts grew mountainous. Houses throughout the Westerlands owed the Lannisters fortunes borrowed and never repaid. By tradition and law, these debts should have been called in, collected, or answered for. Tytos sent reminders, polite at first, then pleading. He received excuses, delays, and eventually silence. When he suggested sending men to collect what was owed, his own advisers counselled patience, gentleness, understanding. Tytos agreed, always agreed, and the debts remained unpaid. The gold that should have filled Lannister vaults stayed in vassal coffers, and the message spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Casterly Rock had grown soft. Then came the Tarbeck defiance, the moment when mockery transformed into open rebellion. Lord Walderan Tarbeck, emboldened by years of ignored debts and unchallenged slights, refused a direct summons to Casterly Rock. When Tytos sent his second son Kevan with a stronger message, the Tarbecks seized 3 Lannister men who had accompanied him and held them hostage. The demand was simple and devastating. Forgive all Tarbeck debts, or the hostages would suffer. This was the moment. This was the crisis that demanded strength, the challenge that required a lord to act like a lord. The entire Westerlands watched to see what Tytos Lannister would do when his own men were held captive, his own authority so thoroughly challenged. Would the lion finally roar? Tytos negotiated. He agreed to the Tarbeck terms. The debts were forgiven, the hostages released, and Walderan Tarbeck returned to his hall, having bent the knee to no one while extracting concessions from the richest house in Westeros. The humiliation was complete. Lesser lords throughout the region began calculating their own debts, measuring their own leverage, wondering what they too might extract from the weak lion of Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister was 15 years old when the Tarbeck hostage crisis resolved itself through his father's capitulation. 15 years old, and already he understood what his father would never learn, that power rests not on gold or goodness, but on the certainty of consequences. That mercy shown to the defiant is cruelty to the loyal. That a reputation for ruthlessness prevents 1,000 challenges, while a reputation for kindness invites them without end. He began to prepare himself, though for what he could not yet fully know. He studied warfare with the master at arms, pushing himself beyond what was required of a lord's heir. He learned the details of Lannister finances, memorizing which houses owed what, which debts ran deepest, and which vassals had grown fat on unpaid obligations. He listened to the whispered conversations among loyal Lannister men, the ones who served because their grandfathers had served, who watched their lord's humiliation with clenched jaws and silent fury. These men, Tywin understood, were the ones he would need when the time came. The time came sooner than anyone expected, though not in the manner young Tywin might have wished. In the year 262, King Jaehaerys II died, and his son Aerys ascended to the Iron Throne as Aerys II of his name. The young king, eager to demonstrate wisdom beyond his years, sought capable men for his counsel. And despite the whispers about Tytos's weakness, the Lannister wealth and the ancient prestige of their house could not be ignored. More importantly, Aerys had befriended Tytus's heir during a tournament years before. He remembered the golden-haired Tywin as serious, capable, and possessed of qualities the father lacked. The raven arrived at Casterly Rock bearing the royal seal. Tywin Lannister, at the age of 20, was summoned to King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King. It was an unprecedented honor for one so young, a recognition of ability that should have brought pride to House Lannister and vindication to Tytos's reign. Instead, it created a cruel division. The son would ride east to rule the Seven Kingdoms in the king's name, wielding power that his father had never properly grasped. And Tytos would remain in the west, still weak, still mocked, still unable to command the respect that his house deserved, and his son was earning in a distant capital. Tywin accepted the appointment with the cold formality that would become his signature. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply began the preparations to depart, organizing his household, selecting the men who would accompany him, and making arrangements for Casterly Rock's governance in his absence. His father would remain as Lord of the Rock, of course, surrounded by advisors who would continue to counsel weakness, vassals who would continue to exploit his kindness, and the slow erosion of Lannister authority that seemed impossible to arrest. The night before his departure for King's Landing, Tywin stood in the gallery of Casterly Rock, looking out over Lannisport and the sunset sea beyond. The wealth of the Westerlands stretched before him, the gold mines, the silver, the trade flowing through the ports, the armies that should have made House Lannister the most feared in all of Westeros. All of it undermined by one man's inability to understand the fundamental nature of power. A servant approached, one of the older men who had served 3 generations of Lannisters. He stood beside the young heir in silence for a moment before speaking. "Your Lord Father means well, my lord. He has a good heart." Tywin did not turn from the window. A good heart is a luxury that lords cannot afford. It profits nothing if the house falls while the heart remains pure. "You're still young yet, my lord. Perhaps in time, there will be nothing left to save." Tywin's voice carried no heat, no anger, just certainty. The Reynes and Tarbecks grow bolder each season, the debts mount higher, and my father forgives and forgets and smiles while lesser men sharpen their knives. The servant had no answer to that. What answer could there be? They both knew the truth. Tywin departed for King's Landing the next morning, riding east with a retinue worthy of a Hand of the King. He was 20 years old, brilliant, and burning with an ambition tempered by shame. In the capital, he would prove his worth. He would show the realm that not all Lannisters were weak, that the lion could still bite when the right man commanded it. And in the west, his father would continue his slow destruction of everything their house had built over centuries. But Tywin had learned his lesson well. He had watched weakness invite destruction. He had seen mercy answered with contempt. He had felt the shame of a great house brought low by a lord who loved too freely and feared too little. These lessons settled in his bones like cold iron, forging the man who would one day be the most feared lord in all the 7 kingdoms. The weak lion would continue to reign for a time, but the hard one had already been born, tempered in humiliation and shame, and he was learning to calculate the precise cost of every decision, every mercy, every moment of weakness. In the forges of his father's failures, Tywin Lannister was becoming something the realm had not seen in generations. A Lannister who understood that gold without fear was merely yellow metal, and that sometimes, to save a house, you must be willing to destroy everything that threatens it, even if that meant drowning your own vassals in the dark. But that reckoning still lay ahead, waiting in the deep places beneath Castamere. King's Landing in the year 262 was a city of ambition and rot, of soaring towers and fetid alleys, where the Iron Throne cast its shadow over 500,000 souls, and the games of power never ceased. Into this nest of vipers came Tywin Lannister, 20 years old and newly appointed Hand of the King, carrying with him the weight of his house's tarnished reputation and a determination to restore what his father had lost. Aerys II received his new hand with genuine warmth. The young king, barely older than Tywin himself, saw in the Lannister heir a kindred spirit, someone serious, capable, and unburdened by the failures of the previous generation. They had met years before at a tournament, had shared wine and conversation, and Aerys remembered being impressed by Tywin's sharp mind and measured words. Now, as king, Aerys believed he had found the perfect instrument to transform his reign into something glorious. The small council chamber became Tywin's arena. Here, surrounded by lords and masters who had served under 3 kings, the young hand began to demonstrate why Aerys's faith had not been misplaced. He absorbed information with frightening speed: trade routes and tax revenues, grain stores and garrison strengths, the intricate web of debts and obligations that held the 7 kingdoms together. Where others saw complexity, Tywin saw patterns. Where they saw tradition, he saw inefficiency. And where they counselled patience, he demanded results. Within his first year as Hand, Tywin reduced the crown's debt by 1/4. He did this not through cruel taxation or borrowing from the Iron Bank, but through ruthless efficiency. Positions that had been sinecures for useless lordlings were eliminated. Corrupt tax collectors found themselves facing the king's justice. Trade agreements that favoured foreign merchants over Westerosi interests were renegotiated or abandoned. The lords of the small council, many of whom had grown comfortable in their positions, found themselves either adapting to the new hand's expectations or finding excuses to retire to their estates. King Aerys was delighted. His hand made him look strong, wise, and effective. The throne's finances improved. The city guard became more disciplined. Trade flourished. Letters arrived from throughout the realm praising the young king's excellent governance, though anyone with eyes could see it was the hand who governed. Aerys did not mind, not yet. In those early years, he basked in the reflected glory, and called Tywin his brother in all but blood. But while Tywin built his reputation in King's Landing, the situation in the Westerlands continued to deteriorate. Ravens arrived regularly at the Hand's chambers, bearing news from Casterly Rock that grew progressively worse. Lord Tytos, freed from his capable son's supervision, had reverted fully to his nature. The debts he had begun to acknowledge, thanks to Tywin's pressure before his departure, were once again ignored or forgiven. The Reynes and Tarbecks, watching the young lion depart for the capital, had grown even bolder in their defiance. Tywin read these reports in the early morning hours, before the rest of the Red Keep stirred. He would stand by the window of his chambers, the parchment in his hand, and feel the familiar cold anger settling over him. Each letter from the West was another humiliation, another demonstration that his father had learned nothing, would never learn anything, and that the work of rebuilding Lannister authority would fall to him alone. The cruel mathematics of the situation became clear. As Hand of the King, Tywin could not simply abandon his post and return to the Westerlands. His duty was here, serving Aerys, managing the realm. And yet, every day he spent in King's Landing was another day his father undermined everything the Lannister name should represent. The more successful Tywin became in the capital, the more obvious the contrast between father and son, and the more the whispers spread. The old lion is weak, but the young one has teeth. In the year 267, matters came to a head. Lord Walderan Tarbeck, the same man who had seized Lannister hostages years before and extracted concessions from Tytos, decided to test the limits of patience once more. He refused to pay taxes owed to Casterly Rock, citing old debts that Tytos had supposedly forgiven. When Tytos sent collectors, Tarbeck's men drove them away with drawn swords. It was open defiance, the kind of challenge that should have been answered with fire and steel. Tytos responded by sending more letters, polite letters, understanding letters. Letters that pleaded for Tarbeck to reconsider, to show reason, to remember the bonds between houses. The Tarbecks used these letters to light their hearthfires and sent no reply at all. The reports reached Tywin in King's Landing, and with them came something else. Letters from loyal Lannister bannermen, men who had served House Lannister for generations and watched the current humiliation with mounting despair. These letters were carefully worded, respectful in their tone, but their message was clear. How long, my Lord Hand? How long must we watch our liege lord mocked and our house dishonoured? How long before the young lion returns to remind the West what it means to defy Casterly Rock? Tywin burned those letters after reading them. He couldn't be seen encouraging dissent against his own father, could not appear to be plotting while serving as Hand of the King. And yet, the question gnawed at him. How long? How much more damage would be done before he could act? What would be left of House Lannister's authority when he finally had the freedom to reclaim it? The answer came in the most final way possible. In the year 267, after another season of humiliations and another failed attempt to reason with increasingly defiant vassals, Tytos Lannister collapsed while walking in the gardens of Casterly Rock. His heart, perhaps worn down by years of stress that his gentle nature couldn't properly acknowledge, simply stopped. The servants found him beneath a lemon tree, his face peaceful, as if he had finally found the rest that had eluded him in life. The raven reached King's Landing 3 days later. Tywin received it in the small council chamber, in the middle of a discussion about grain subsidies for the Reach. He read the message once, his face showing nothing, then excused himself from the council and returned to his chambers. There, alone, he permitted himself one moment of reaction, not grief, precisely, though he had loved his father in the complicated way that sons love fathers who disappoint them. Rather, it was a moment of recognition. The weight had shifted. The burden was now fully his. He did not weep. Tywin Lannister had learned long ago that tears accomplished nothing. Instead, he sat at his desk and began to write. Letters to the Westerlands, informing the bannerman of his father's death and his own assumption of the lordship. Letters to the king, requesting leave to return home and settle his father's affairs. Letters to the Castellan of Casterly Rock with specific instructions about security and about which visitors should and should not be permitted entry. And one letter, marked with the Lannister seal but sent to no specific recipient, that simply said, "I am coming home." King Aerys granted Tywin leave with genuine sadness. He had lost his most capable advisor, at least temporarily, and he knew it. But protocol demanded that a lord return to claim his inheritance, and Aerys could hardly refuse. He asked only that Tywin return to King's Landing as soon as possible, that the realm needed its hand. Tywin agreed with appropriate solemnity, though he knew even then that his return might be delayed longer than the young king anticipated. The journey west took 2 weeks. Tywin rode with a modest retinue, enough men to demonstrate his status as Hand and Lord of Casterly Rock, but not so many as to seem like he was leading an army. He used the time to think, to plan, to calculate. His father's death had freed him from the immediate problem of filial duty, but it had also created a crisis of authority. The Westerlands had lived under weak leadership for so long that many would test the new Lord Lannister, wondering if the son was truly different from the father or merely younger and less experienced. The Reynes and Tarbecks, in particular, would be watching. They had grown comfortable in their defiance, rich on debts they never repaid, bold from challenges that never received a proper answer. Would the young lord prove as tractable as his father? Would he prioritize peace over justice, understanding over strength? These questions needed answers, and Tywin had learned from his father's example what kind of answers were required. Not words, not negotiations, not patience or understanding, or the hope that reasonable men would eventually see reason. His father had tried all of that, and his father had failed. No. The answer would need to be written in a language that everyone in the 7 kingdoms could understand, the language of consequences, the language of fear. Casterly Rock loomed before him as he approached that great mountain fortress where Lannisters had ruled for thousands of years. The banners flew at half-mast for his father, black ribbons fluttering in the western wind. The gates opened before him, and the assembled household knelt as he passed. This was his now, the rock, the gold, the mines, the armies, the power that should have made House Lannister unassailable, but which his father's weakness had nearly destroyed. Tywin dismounted in the main courtyard and walked directly to the great hall. The Castellan and the senior household staff awaited him there, along with representatives from the principal Lannister bannermen. These were the men who had served his father, who had watched the slow erosion of authority, who now looked to him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He did not offer platitudes about his father. He did not speak of grief or loss. Instead, he spoke about the future. "The old way is dead," Tywin said, his voice carrying through the hall with absolute certainty. "House Lannister will be respected, our debts will be paid, our laws will be obeyed, and those who have forgotten what it means to serve the lion will be reminded." The men in the hall understood. Some of them had been waiting years to hear these words. Others felt a chill of apprehension, wondering just how far the new lord would go to restore his house's honour. They would all learn soon enough. That night, Tywin sat in his father's chambers, his chambers now, and reviewed the detailed accounts of every debt owed to House Lannister, every slight unanswered, every challenge unmet. The list was long. The humiliations were many. But 2 names appeared more frequently than any others, 2 houses that had profited most from Tytos's weakness, and whose continued defiance would undermine any attempt to restore Lannister authority. House Reyne of Castamere, House Tarbeck of Tarbeck Hall. The next morning, Tywin sent for his uncle Sir Keevan, the brother who had always been loyal, who had watched their father's failures with the same cold understanding. When Kevin arrived, Tywin showed him the accounts, the list of debts and defiances. "They will need to be dealt with," Tywin said simply. Kevin studied the documents and then looked at his nephew. "How far are you prepared to go?" "As far as necessary." Tywin's voice held no emotion, no anger, no satisfaction, just certainty. They have been allowed to believe that Lannister mercy is weakness. That belief must be corrected, permanently. And if they bend the knee, if they offer to pay what they owe... Tywin was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he spoke words that would echo through the years to come, words that revealed just how completely his father's failures had shaped him. They had their chance for that. Every day of my father's reign was a chance. They chose defiance. Now they will. Learn what defiance costs. The die was cast. The lesson was about to be taught. And in the deep places beneath Castamere, in the halls of Tarbeck, the lords who had grown fat on Lannister weakness were about to discover that the young lion was nothing like his father. The Reynes were coming. The clerk's name was Lyman, and he had served House Lannister for 12 years without anyone truly noticing him. He kept the accounts, copied the letters, maintained the records of grain stores and tax revenues, and the 1,000 small details that kept a great house functioning. He was neither high-born enough to matter, nor low-born enough to dismiss. Just another face in the vast machinery of Casterly Rock, invisible and essential in equal measure. It was Lyman who first saw the true scope of what Lord Tywin was planning. 3 days after assuming the lordship, Tywin summoned him to the Solar. Lyman arrived with his ledgers, expecting routine questions about the estate's finances. Instead, the new Lord of Casterly Rock handed him a list of names. Every bannerman who owed military service to House Lannister, organized by proximity, strength, and historical loyalty. "I need to know," Tywin said, his voice carrying that flat certainty that Lyman would come to recognize as his lord's natural tone. "Which of these houses can be called upon immediately, which requires more persuasion, which might hesitate, and which have been compromised by association with the Reynes or Tarbecks?" Lyman studied the list and practiced catching the implications immediately. This was not about routine matters. This was preparation for war. "My lord," he said carefully, "such an assessment would take time to compile accurately. You have 2 days." Lyman worked through 2 nights with barely any sleep, pulling records going back decades, cross-referencing marriages and debts and ancient feuds. He tracked which houses had been forgiven debts by Lord Tytos. Those might feel gratitude, or might feel emboldened. He noted which lords had sons or daughters married into the Reyne or Tarbeck families. Those would need careful handling. He documented which bannermen had been most vocal in their private complaints about Lannister weakness. Those would be the most eager to serve a strong lord. The picture that emerged was complex, but clear. Most of the Westerlands would follow Tywin without question, either from loyalty, ambition, or simple calculation that the young hand of the king represented strength. But a handful of houses occupied dangerous middle ground, tied by blood or debt or friendship to the Reynes and Tarbecks, uncertain which side of the coming storm offered a safer harbour. Tywin read Lyman's report in silence, his green eyes moving down the pages with mechanical precision. When he finished, he looked up at the clerk for the first time, with something approaching attention. "This is thorough work. You understand what it means?" "I believe so, my lord." then you understand what I require of you. Absolute discretion, perfect accuracy, and the willingness to work at any hour without complaint or question. Lyman nodded. He had just become, without quite realizing it, one of the instruments of Tywin Lannister's will. There would be no going back to comfortable anonymity. The summons went out the next week. Not a general call to arms. That would have been too obvious, too alarming. Instead, carefully worded letters to specific lords requesting their presence at Casterly Rock to discuss matters of mutual concern. The loyal houses received straightforward invitations. The uncertain ones received letters mentioning old debts owed to them by House Lannister, promises that those debts would be honoured, that the new lord remembered his obligations. The implication was clear. Side with me now, and past grievances will be forgiven. The lords came. They arrived in small groups over the course of 2 weeks, each summons timed so that the castle gradually filled with armed men without creating the appearance of mobilization. Lord Lefford of the Golden Tooth arrived first, bringing 200 men and pledging them without hesitation. House Crakehall came next, then Banefort, then Serret. Each arrival was noted, recorded, and integrated into the growing strength gathering at Casterly Rock. Lyman watched it all from his position in the administrative chambers. He saw how Tywin greeted each lord personally, how he acknowledged their service, how he made each man feel valued without ever promising anything beyond what was proper. There was no warmth in these encounters, but there was respect. The lords were being shown that the new Lannister understood the difference between their loyalty and the defiance of others. In the evenings, after the formal receptions, Tywin met with his inner council. His uncle Sir Keevan was there, solid and reliable. The Master-at-Arms attended, discussing logistics and supply lines. And increasingly, Lyman found himself summoned to these meetings, carrying his ledgers and providing answers to questions about provisions, road conditions, and the capacity of various keeps to supply or support military operations. It was during one of these sessions that Lyman fully understood what was being planned. The Tarbecks are the weaker target, Sir Kevan was saying, pointing to a map of the Westerlands spread across the table. Tarbeck Hall is well fortified, but they can field perhaps 300 men at most. If we move quickly... We move methodically, Tywin interrupted. Speed matters less than certainty. I want every approach secured, every supply line established, every potential ally of theirs isolated before we march a single soldier toward their walls. That could take weeks, my lord. Then it takes weeks. This is not about punishing the Tarbecks quickly. It is about demonstrating to the entire Westerlands that defiance of House Lannister will be answered completely, thoroughly, and without mercy. If we rush, and they escape. If we attack, and they negotiate a surrender. If anything less than total victory is achieved, we will have wasted this opportunity. The Master-at-Arms shifted uncomfortably. My lord, such a campaign, the cost in time and resources, will be less than the cost of allowing rebellion to go unpunished. Tywin's voice remained level, but something in his tone ended the discussion. Calculate what you need. Lyman will ensure the resources are available. And so Lyman found himself calculating the price of war. So many bushels of grain to feed an army of this size for this many weeks. So many wagons to transport supplies. So many horses, so many blacksmiths, so many barrels of pitch and cords of wood and pounds of nails. The mathematics of destruction rendered in neat columns and careful script. The interesting thing, Lyman noticed, was that Tywin never discussed the war as if it were uncertain. There was no debate about whether to act, no consideration of negotiation or compromise. The decision had been made before the First Lord arrived at Casterly Rock. Everything that followed was simply preparation, the mechanical process of ensuring that when the blow fell, it would be devastating. Messages began flowing in both directions. To King's Landing, careful letters keep Aerys informed of developments in the west, framed as a lord dealing with unruly vassals, rather than anything that might concern the crown. To other regions, quiet communications with lords who might have connections to the Reynes or Tarbecks, making clear that this was a Westerlands matter and that interference would be noted and remembered. To the Citadel, a request for a maester skilled in siege engineering. Not that Tywin announced this purpose, but Lyman knew what the request implied. And to the Rhaeners and Tarbecks themselves, nothing. No demands, no ultimatums, no warnings, just silence from Casterly Rock, heavy and ominous as a gathering storm. Lord Walderan Tarbeck apparently noticed that silence. A raven arrived bearing the Tarbeck seal, addressed to Lord Tywin, with an offer to discuss outstanding debts and come to some arrangement. The tone was careful, almost conciliatory. The first hint of concern from a house that had spent years treating Lannister authority as a suggestion, rather than a command. Tywin read the letter once and handed it to Lyman without comment. "Should I prepare a response, my lord?" "No. They seem willing to negotiate. They are willing to delay, to probe for weakness, to buy time while they prepare their own defences or seek allies." Tywin stood and walked to the window overlooking Lannisport. "My father received 100 such letters. He negotiated, he compromised, he showed understanding. And they learned that defiance was safe because Lannister threats were empty. We will teach a different lesson. And if they pay what they owe." Tywin turned, and for the first time Lyman saw something approaching, emotion in his lord's face. Not anger, precisely. Something colder. They had 20 years to pay what they owed. They had 1,000 opportunities to show respect, to honour their oaths, to remember what it means to serve House Lannister. They chose mockery instead. Now they will learn what that choice costs. By the 4th week after Tywin's return to Casterly Rock, nearly 2,000 men had assembled. They filled the training yards, camped in the fields outside Lannisport, and drilled daily under the Master-at-Arms' demanding eye. Lords who had not seen proper military discipline in years found their men being shaped into something more professional, more dangerous. Lyman watched the transformation from his administrative post. He saw farmers' sons learning to hold formation. He saw household knights drilling in coordinated charges. He saw the wagons being loaded with supplies, the weapons being sharpened and counted. The systematic preparation of an army that would march not for glory or conquest, but for a very specific purpose: the annihilation of 2 houses that had forgotten their place. The night before the march, Tywin summoned his principal commanders to the Great Hall. Lyman attended to record the meeting. The assembled lords stood around the map table: Kevan Lannister, Lord Lefford, the Crakehalls, the Master-at-Arms, and a dozen others. These were the men who would carry out Tywin's will. "Tomorrow we march," Tywin began without preamble. "We will move in 3 columns. The main force will proceed toward Tarbeck Hall. Lord Lefford, you will take 500 men and secure the roads to the north, ensuring no Reyne forces can come to Tarbeck's aid. Sir Cavan, you will command a reserve force that remains mobile, ready to respond to any contingency. He detailed the march route, the supply points, and the communication protocols. Every question was anticipated and answered. Every contingency had been considered. This was not a lord seeking counsel from his bannermen. This was a general issuing orders to subordinates. "What of the Reynes, my lord?" Lord Craighall asked. "Should we expect them to respond?" "The Reynes will wait to see what happens to the Tarbecks," Tywin said with absolute certainty. "They believe themselves secure in Castamere. Let them believe it a while longer. Our business with them will come after we have finished with the Tarbecks." "And if either house attempts to negotiate?" Tywin's answer was immediate. "There will be no negotiation. No surrender will be accepted. This is not a punitive expedition to extract payment or oaths. This is an extermination. When we are finished, neither House Tarbeck nor House Reyne will exist. Their names will be cautionary tales, their seats will be ruined, and every lord in the Westerlands will understand, with perfect clarity, what it means to defy Casterly Rock." The hall was silent. Some of the assembled lords looked uncomfortable. This went beyond normal warfare, beyond the usual patterns of submission and mercy that governed conflicts between noble houses. But no one objected. They had all witnessed the years of humiliation under Tytos. They understood, perhaps better than Tywin realized, the necessity of what he was doing. Lyman wrote it all down in his careful script, recording the moment when Lord Tywin Lannister committed fully to the path that would define his rule. No half measures, no mercy. Just the cold calculation that sometimes, to save a house, you must be willing to destroy everything that threatens it. The next morning the army marched, 2,000 men moving west through the Lannister lands, their banners bright in the spring sun. Lyman rode with the supply wagons, his ledgers carefully packed, ready to record whatever came next. He did not know, could not fully imagine, what he was about to witness. But he knew this. The weak lion was dead and buried. The hard one was marching to war, and the Westerlands would never be the same. The army reached the hills of Tarbeck territory on the 7th day of marching. Lyman had never seen a military force deployed with such methodical precision. This was not the glorious cavalry charge of songs and stories. This was something colder, more deliberate, the systematic isolation and strangulation of an enemy who had not yet fully realized they were already defeated. Lord Tywin established his command camp on a rise overlooking Tarbeck Hall, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain secure. The positioning was deliberate. He wanted the Tarbecks to see the Lannister banners, to count the campfires at night, to understand exactly how many men had come for them. Fear, Lyman was learning, was as much a weapon as steel. Tarbeck Hall was not Casterly Rock, but it was no minor keep either. The castle sat atop a rocky outcrop, its walls 30 feet high and reinforced with towers at each corner. Lord Walderan Tarbeck's grandfather had spent a fortune strengthening those defences, and they had never been seriously tested. The approach was steep and exposed. Any assault would cost dearly in lives. Tywin had no intention of assaulting. "Surround it," he ordered his commanders on the first evening. "No one enters, no one leaves. Every road, every path, every goat track that leads to or from that castle is to be blocked. They will receive nothing from the outside world. Not food, not water, not messages, nothing." Sir Kevan studied the terrain. A complete encirclement will require spreading our forces thin in places. If they sally forth, They won't. Tywin's certainty was absolute. Walderan Tarbeck has spent 20 years avoiding confrontation. He is a man who seizes hostages and demands negotiation, not one who leads desperate charges. He will wait inside his walls, expecting that we will eventually lose patience, or that someone will come to mediate. He is wrong on both counts. And so the siege began, though to call it a siege seemed almost too dramatic for what actually transpired. The Lannister forces simply waited. They established camps at every approach. They built watchtowers to observe the castle. They settled into a routine of patrols and rotations, making clear that this was not a temporary show of force, but a permanent presence. Lyman established his administrative post in a large tent near Tywin's command pavilion. From there, he managed the flow of supplies to the besieging army, tracked the rotation of troops, and maintained the detailed records that Tywin demanded. Every bushel of grain consumed, every arrow requisitioned, every man rotated to and from the siege lines. All of it was documented with meticulous care. On the third day, a rider emerged from Tarbeck Hall under a white banner. He was a young knight, barely 20, his armour polished and his bearing nervous. The Lannister sentries escorted him to Tywin's pavilion, where the Lord of Casterly Rock received him with the same expression he used for reviewing tax accounts. Flat, emotionless, mildly impatient. "I bear a message from Lord Walderan Tarbeck," the knight began, his voice carefully steady. "My lord wishes to discuss terms. He acknowledges that certain debts have been allowed to lapse and offers to make full payment, with interest, in exchange for the withdrawal of your forces." Tywin let the silence stretch. Lyman, seated in the corner with his writing materials, watched his lord's face remain completely unchanged. "Is that all?" Tywin finally asked. "My Lord Tarbeck also offers his personal apology for any offence given during the previous lord's reign. He wishes it to be known that he always had great respect for House Lannister and for your Lord Father's memory." How touching. Tywin's voice carried no inflection whatsoever. "Return to your lord and tell him this. There will be no negotiation. There will be no terms. There will be no withdrawal. Tell him to look at my army and understand that I did not bring 2,000 men to collect a debt. I brought them to teach a lesson." The knight's composure cracked slightly. "My lord, surely there is some arrangement—" "There is not." Tywin stood, signalling the end of the audience. "You have my answer. Deliver it." The knight left, his white banner offering safe passage, but no comfort. Lyman watched him ride back toward Tarbeck Hall, and wondered what Lord Walderan's face would look like when he received Tywin's response. Did he understand yet? Did he realize that the rules had changed? That the mercy he had grown accustomed to exploiting no longer existed? A week passed, then 2. The Lannister army maintained its positions with the same mechanical efficiency. Soldiers rotated in and out of the siege lines on a regular schedule. No one became too tired or bored or careless. Supply wagons arrived from Lannisport on a predictable timetable. The routine was mind-numbing in its precision, and that was precisely the point. This siege could continue indefinitely. The Lannisters had the resources, the organization, and the absolute patience to wait as long as necessary. Tarbeck Hall, by contrast, was beginning to show signs of strain. Lyman learned this from the scouts who observed the castle walls. Fewer sentries were visible during the day, suggesting men were being pulled inside, perhaps to deal with rationing disputes or growing unrest. Smoke from the kitchens decreased, a sign that cooking fuel was being conserved. Small tells, but significant ones. On the 18th day, 3 more riders emerged under white banners. This time, they were not requesting negotiation, but pleading for it. They brought word that Lord Walderan would pay triple the original debt, would send his son as a hostage to ensure good behaviour, would swear renewed oaths before the High Septon himself if necessary. Tywin did not even grant them an audience. He had Sir Kevin deliver his response. Lord Tywin has nothing to discuss with House Tarbeck. Return to your keep. That night, Lyman was working in his tent when Tywin entered unexpectedly. The Lord of Casterly Rock rarely visited the administrative areas, preferring to summon people to him. His presence was startling. "My lord," Lyman began, rising from his stool. "Sit. Continue your work." Tywin stood near the tent opening, looking out toward Tarbeck Hall, visible as a dark shape against the stars. "Tell me, Lyman, what do you think is happening inside those walls right now?" It was the first time Tywin had asked for his opinion on anything beyond logistics. Lyman chose his words carefully. "Fear, my lord. Confusion. They expected negotiation, some form of resolution. Instead, they face silence and certainty. They are beginning to understand that their situation is not temporary." "Good." Tywin was quiet for a moment. "Do you think I'm cruel?" The question was so unexpected that Lyman forgot to be cautious. "I think you are necessary, my lord." Tywin turned to look at him, those green eyes catching the lamplight. "Explain." "Your father, forgive me, my lord. Your father was kind. He believed in mercy and second chances, and every house in the Westerlands learned to exploit that kindness. They took, and nothing was ever done to stop them. If you showed that same mercy now, they would simply return to taking. You are not being cruel. You are being clear." Clear. Tywin seemed to taste the word. Yes. Clarity is what is required. My father's greatest failing was not that he was kind, but that he was inconsistent. He made threats he did not keep. He established rules he did not enforce. And so everyone learned that Lannister words meant nothing. I will not make that mistake. When I say there will be no negotiation, I mean it absolutely. When I promise consequences, I deliver them completely. That is not cruelty. That is governance. He left without another word, but Lyman felt he had just received a glimpse into the mind that was reshaping the Westerlands. Tywin Lannister was not motivated by sadism or anger. He was motivated by the simple belief that power without the will to use it was not power at all, merely the illusion of it. And illusions eventually shattered, usually at great cost to everyone. The siege entered its 4th week. Inside Tarbeck Hall, desperation was beginning to show. Scouts reported seeing people on the walls at odd hours, and heard shouting that suggested internal disputes. The castle was eating itself from within, its inhabitants turning on each other as resources dwindled and hope faded. Then, on the 26th day, the gates opened. It was not a surrender. It was an attempted breakout. Lord Walderan Tarbeck led perhaps 200 men in a desperate charge toward the eastern siege line, the point where the Lannister forces were spread thinnest. It was not a bad plan, tactically. Hit the weak point hard, break through, scatter into the countryside, and try to reach some kind of safety or reinforcement. But Tywin had anticipated this exact move. The eastern line was thin by design, and hidden behind the visible positions were another 300 men waiting in reserve. When the Tarbecks charged, they broke through the first line easily, too easily, and suddenly found themselves surrounded on 3 sides with nowhere to retreat. Lyman did not witness the battle firsthand. He was with the supply train, well back from the fighting. But he heard it, the clash of steel, the screams of men and horses, the particular sound of violence that once heard is never forgotten. And he saw the aftermath when the wounded were brought back to the camp. The Tarbeck breakout had lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it was over, Lord Walderan lay dead on the field with a Lannister spear through his chest. His 2 eldest sons died beside him. Of the 200 men who had ridden out, perhaps 30 made it back inside the castle, and twice that number lay dead or dying on the field. The rest surrendered, and were taken as prisoners. Tywin observed the carnage from his position on the rise, his expression unchanged. When the field was clear and the count completed, he gave his next order. "Bring me the prisoners, all of them." They were assembled in chains before the Lannister camp, knights and men-at-arms, and even a few household servants who had been caught in the breakout. 73 men in total, bloody and defeated, looking up at the Lord of Casterly Rock, who held their lives in his hands. Lyman watched from his usual position, writing tablet in hand, waiting to record whatever judgment Tywin pronounced. In normal warfare, these prisoners would be ransomed or taken as hostages. Many were from minor noble families, worth coins if nothing else. It would be the practical decision, the expected decision. Tywin looked down at them for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the assembled prisoners and the Lannister soldiers who guarded them. "You swore oaths to House Lannister. You broke them. You followed a lord who defied his rightful liege. That defiance ends here." He turned to Sir Cavan. "Hang them. Everyone." The silence that followed was profound. Even the prisoners seemed stunned, unable to quite believe what they had heard. A few began to protest, to plead, to explain that they had only followed their lord's commands. Tywin ignored them all. "My lord," one of the Lannister commanders ventured, "some of these men are of noble birth. There will be ransoms to collect." "I did not come here for ransom." Tywin's voice cut through the objection like a blade. "I came here to teach a lesson. The lesson is this. When you break your oaths to House Lannister, when you defy the authority of Casterly Rock, when you choose rebellion over service, you die. Not ransomed, not forgiven, dead. Carry out the order." They built the gallows that afternoon, using timber from the siege equipment. 73 nooses, arranged in neat rows. The prisoners were hanged in groups of 10, the process taking hours. Tywin watched it all from beginning to end, his face showing nothing. Lyman forced himself to watch as well, to record the names and the houses, to maintain the meticulous documentation that his lord required. It was the most horrible thing Lyman had ever witnessed. And yet, he understood the purpose. Every soldier in the Lannister army was watching. Every scout from neighbouring houses who might be observing from the hills was watching. The message was being delivered with absolute clarity. This is what rebellion costs. With Lord Walderan dead and his forces shattered, Tarbeck Hall had no hope of continued resistance. The next morning, the gates opened again, and this time it was a true surrender. Lady Ellen Tarbeck, the same woman who had once been Lord Tytos's mistress, who had helped teach him that mercy was weakness, emerged with the remaining garrison and the castle's inhabitants. She was older now, her beauty faded, and as she knelt before Tywin, Lyman saw something in her eyes that might have been recognition. She knew this young lord. She had known him as a boy, had been present during his father's greatest humiliations. And now, here he stood, holding absolute power over her life. "I surrender Tarbeck Hall," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "I offer no resistance. I ask only for mercy for those who remain, the servants, the small folk who had no part in my husband's decisions." Tywin looked down at her without expression. "You ask for mercy. How interesting. Did my father not show you mercy? Did he not forgive every debt, overlook every slight, tolerate every humiliation you and your husband inflicted upon him?" "He did, my lord. And you learned the wrong lesson from his mercy. You learned that Lannisters were weak, that our words were empty, that you could take and take without consequence." Tywin's voice remained flat, but something in it made Lyman's skin crawl. "I am here to teach a different lesson." He gestured to his guards. "Take Lady Tarbeck and her children into custody. The servants and small folk may leave and return to their families. They will not be harmed. They are guilty of nothing but serving the wrong master." It was more mercy than Lyman had expected, given what had happened to the soldiers. But then Tywin added the final instruction. "Burn Tarbeck Hall. Leave no stones standing. I want nothing to remain but ash and memory." They spent 3 days doing exactly that. The Lannister soldiers stripped the castle of anything valuable, distributed it among the army, or sent it back to Casterly Rock. Then they set fires throughout the structure. In the Great Hall, the towers, the storerooms, the family chapel. Tarbeck Hall had stood for 200 years. It burned for 2 days. Lyman watched it burn and made his careful notations. Square footage destroyed. Estimated value of materials lost. Number of refugees created. The mathematics of annihilation rendered in his neat script. When it was over, when nothing remained but blackened stone and smoke-stained ruins, Tywin stood where Tarbeck Hall had been and addressed his army. "Let every lord in the Westerlands see this and understand. House Tarbeck is no more. Their castle is destroyed. Their lands are forfeit. Their name will be remembered only as a warning. This is the price of defiance. This is what happens when you forget your oaths." He paused, letting his words sink in, then added the final blow. "And we are not finished. House Reyne still stands. They still think themselves safe in Castamere. They still believe that ancient names and strong walls will protect them from consequence. We will teach them the same lesson. We march for Castamere at dawn." The army prepared to move. Lyman oversaw the loading of supplies, the organization of the column, all the tedious logistics that enabled 2,000 men to march with purpose. But his mind kept returning to those gallows, to that burning castle, to the systematic erasure of a house that had existed for centuries. This was what Tywin Lannister meant by clarity, by consistency, by the certainty of consequences. It was horrifying in its completeness, terrifying in its cold efficiency, and it was, Lyman had to admit, effective. Word of Tarbeck Hall's fate was already spreading. Riders from other houses had observed from a distance and were carrying the news throughout the Westerlands. The weak lion was dead. The hard one had shown his teeth. And now those teeth were turning toward Castamere, where the red lion of House Reyne waited, perhaps still believing that his own strength would be sufficient to avoid Tarbeck's fate. He would learn otherwise. They would all learn. The rains of Castamere were about to begin. The march to Castamere took 4 days. 4 days during which word of Tarbeck Hall's destruction spread like wildfire across the Westerlands. Lyman saw the effect in the villages they passed. Peasants who emerged to watch the army march by with expressions of fear. And something else, something that might have been satisfaction. The small folk had suffered under the chaos of weak lordship too, had watched their betters squabble and defy without consequence. No consequence had arrived, terrible and absolute, and there was a grim comfort in knowing that the natural order was being restored, even if the restoration was written in blood and ash. Castamere was different from Tarbeck Hall in almost every way that mattered. Where the Tarbecks had built up, the Reynes had built down. The castle itself was modest, a relatively small keep and curtain wall on the surface, nothing that would intimidate an army of 2,000 men. But beneath that surface lay the true strength of Castamere, a vast network of mines and halls carved into the rock itself, expanded over centuries, until they formed an underground fortress more extensive than many surface castles. The gold had run out generations ago, but the tunnels remained, a labyrinth of passages, chambers, and galleries that extended deep into the earth. 9 levels, according to the records Lyman had reviewed. 9 levels of stone corridors and reinforced halls, with their own wells for water, storage chambers that could hold years of provisions, and enough space to house the entire Reyne household and garrison comfortably. It was said that an army could camp outside Castamere for years and never force its defenders to surrender, that the underground fortress was impregnable to any conventional siege. Lord Roger Reyne, called the Red Lion, had apparently taken these legends to heart. When the Lannister army arrived and established positions around Castamere, there was no sign of the Reynes on the surface. They had withdrawn into their depths, sealed the entrances, and settled in to wait. The message was clear. If Tywin Lannister wanted them, he would have to come down into the dark and dig them out, level by level, corridor by corridor, paying in blood for every foot of stone. Tywin established his command post on the same rise where Castamere Keep stood, looking down at the sealed mine entrances. Lyman set up his administrative tent nearby and waited for orders. Around them, the Lannister forces deployed with the same methodical precision that had characterized the Tarbeck siege, surrounding the area, establishing watch rotations, setting up supply lines. But there was uncertainty now, a sense that the easy part was over. You could burn a castle. You could starve out defenders on the surface. But how did you conquer the stone itself? How did you fight an enemy who could retreat into the earth and wait in perfect safety? The answer, as Lyman was about to learn, required a mind that saw solutions where others saw impossibility. Tywin spent the first day walking the perimeter of Castamere, studying the landscape with the same intensity he had once used to study the ledgers of Lannister debts. He examined the sealed mine entrances, noted the locations of natural springs and streams, and observed the way water flowed through the terrain. He spoke little, asked occasional questions of his engineers and miners, and gave no hint of what he was planning. On the second day, he summoned the Master of Mines from Casterly Rock, a grizzled man named Torrance, who had spent 40 years overseeing the Lannister gold mines, and knew more about underground excavation than any Meister. Lyman was present for that meeting, tasked with recording the technical details. Tywin spread a map of Castamere's known tunnels across his campaign table. Information gathered from former miners, old surveys, and the kind of intelligence that wealthy houses maintained about their neighbors' defenses. 9 levels, Tywin said, tracing the map with one finger. The lowest is 300 feet down. They have their own water source on level 5, storage on levels 3 and 4, living quarters throughout. Tell me, Torrance, how does water reach level 5? The old miner leaned over the map, his experienced eye finding details that Lyman could barely understand. Here, my lord, and here, natural aquifers tap into underground streams. The water seeps through the rock and collects in chambers they've carved to channel it. That's how they can survive down there indefinitely. They're not relying on cisterns, but on flowing water. And these aquifers, where do they originate? Torrance pointed to the hills above Castamere. Springs in the high country, my lord. The water flows through the rock layers, following natural fissures and seams. It's not a river, exactly, but a whole network of underground streams filtering through the stone. Tywin was silent for a long moment, studying the map. When he spoke again, his voice carried that particular certainty that Lyman had learned to recognize as the sound of a decision made. What would happen if we redirected those streams? If instead of feeding the aquifers, the water flowed directly into the mine shafts? Torrance's eyes widened. My lord, you're talking about... I'm talking about flooding them. All 9 levels. Slowly or quickly, it makes no difference. I'm talking about turning their greatest strength into their tomb. Tywin looked up from the map. Can it be done? The old miner was quiet, thinking. Lyman watched the calculations play across his weathered face, not whether it was possible, but how it could be accomplished, what it would require, how long it would take. Aye, my lord, it can be done. We'd need to dig channels in the hills, redirect the springs, breach the sealed mine entrances to allow water entry. It would take time. Weeks, perhaps. And we'd need men who understand mining, who can judge where to dig and how to control the flow. You have such men? I can gather them, my lord. Then do so. Begin immediately. I want every detail planned before we break the first ground. Tywin straightened. His decision made. House Reyne believes they are safe in their stone warren. We will show them that stone drowns as surely as wood burns. The work began the next day. Torrance gathered every miner and engineer within the Lannister army, supplemented by specialists brought from Casterly Rock's own mines. They climbed into the hills above Castamere and began the painstaking work of surveying the springs, mapping the underground water flow, calculating where and how to dig the channels that would redirect the natural streams. Lyman accompanied them on several of these expeditions, recording their findings, tracking the resources consumed, and maintaining the documentation that Tywin demanded. He watched skilled men examine rock faces and declare with certainty that water flowed behind them. He saw engineers sketch plans for channels and sluice gates that would control the flooding. He witnessed the transformation of the natural landscape into weapons. It took 3 weeks of preparation, 3 weeks during which the Lannister army maintained its positions around Castamere, while the real work happened in the hills above. 3 weeks during which Lord Roger Reyne sat in his underground fortress, perhaps wondering why Tywin made no move to assault the entrances, perhaps growing confident that the Lannisters lacked the will or ability to force him out. During this time, a herald emerged from one of the sealed mine entrances under a white banner. He carried a message from the Red Lion himself, offering terms. House Reyne would acknowledge Tywin as their rightful liege, would pay triple the debts owed, and would send hostages to Casterly Rock. In exchange, the Lannisters would withdraw and allow the Reynes to emerge with honour intact. Tywin received this message while inspecting the digging operations in the hills. He read it once, handed it to Lyman without comment, and returned his attention to the water channels taking shape in the stone. "My lord," the herald ventured, "Lord Reyne awaits your response." "Tell Lord Reyne," Tywin said, not looking up from the engineer's latest calculations, "that he should have considered terms before he spent 20 years mocking my father's mercy. Tell him that his castle will become his tomb, and his house will drown in the dark. Tell him that I do not negotiate with the dead." The herald's face went pale. "My lord, surely you have your message. Deliver it, and do not return." The herald fled back to Castamere. Lyman watched him go and wondered what Lord Roger's face looked like when he heard that response. Did he understand yet? Did he realize that this was not about money, or oaths, or political advantage, but about something far more fundamental? The complete destruction of anyone who had learned to treat Lannister authority as a joke. The water channels were completed on the 37th day of the siege. They were not obvious from the surface, carefully concealed, engineered to look like natural features of the landscape. But they were ready. Sluice gates held back the redirected springs, waiting for the order to open. Below, at the sealed mine entrances, Lannister sappers had worked in secret to weaken the barriers, not enough to allow defenders to emerge, but enough to ensure that when water came, it would find its way inside. Tywin inspected the work personally, walking the length of the channels, examining the gates, questioning the engineers about flow rates and timing. And when he was satisfied, he gathered his commanders for final instructions. "When the water is released," he told them, "it will take hours to fill the upper levels and days to flood to the lower ones. The Reynes will have time to attempt escape. Every exit, every airshaft, every possible route to the surface must be guarded. Anyone who emerges is to be taken prisoner. No one escapes. No one." Sir Kevin raised the question that several others were clearly thinking. "My lord, if they attempt to surrender, if Lord Reyne offers to yield the castle and submit to justice, then he will submit to my justice, which is death." Tywin's voice carried no anger, no satisfaction, just certainty. House Reyne ends today. Every man, every woman, every child who bears that name will die. Their line will be extinguished, their castle will become a flooded ruin, and their fate will be sung about for 1,000 years as a reminder of what happens when you defy House Lannister. The silence that followed was profound. What Tywin was proposing went beyond normal warfare, beyond the usual patterns of conquest and submission. He was talking about genocide, the deliberate extinction of an entire bloodline, innocents included. Lord Lefford, one of the older commanders, cleared his throat carefully. "My lord, the children. Surely the children bear no guilt in their father's crimes." Tywin turned to look at him, and Lyman saw something in his lord's eyes that made him grateful he was not the focus of that gaze. "The Reynes have children. Do you know who else had children? Every loyal Lannister man who suffered because of Reyne defiance. Every small folk family that starved because taxes went unpaid. Every house that watched us be humiliated and wondered if they too could defy their oaths without consequence. Those children, the children of the loyal, are my concern, not the spawn of traitors. My lord, this discussion is over. The order stands. Every Reyne dies." Tywin's tone made clear that further argument would be unwelcome. "Open the gates at dawn." That night, Lyman could not sleep. He sat in his tent, trying to work on his ledgers, but his mind kept returning to what was coming. He had watched Tarbeck Hall burn. He had seen the gallows. He had documented every death and destruction that Tywin had ordered. But this was different. This was not the heat of battle, or the execution of soldiers. This was the planned drowning of entire families, children included, trapped in the dark beneath the earth. And yet, he understood the logic. Partial measures had failed for 20 years under Lord Tytos. Mercy had been mistaken for weakness. Every time a debt was forgiven, every time a challenge went unanswered, the message had been reinforced. Lannisters are soft. Lannisters can be pushed. Lannisters will eventually compromise. Tywin was writing a different message, one that would never be forgotten, one that would make the very name Lannister synonymous with absolute consequence. Dawn came cold and grey. Lyman stood with the other observers on the rise above Castamere as Torrance and his engineers opened the sluice gates. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the water began to flow. Not a dramatic flood, but a steady, inexorable stream finding its way down the channels toward the mine entrances. The water reached the first entrance within an hour. The weakened barriers gave way, and the stream found its way inside, flowing down into the darkness. Within 2 hours, all 3 main entrances were breached, and water was pouring into Castamere from multiple points. Still, there was no reaction from below. Perhaps the Reynes didn't yet understand what was happening. Perhaps they thought it was just seepage, a problem to be dealt with, but not a crisis. The upper levels were extensive. It would take time for the water to accumulate noticeably. By midday, they knew. Lyman saw smoke emerging from air shafts. The Reynes were burning something, trying to create enough heat to draw air through the vents, trying to signal for help, or perhaps just to see better in the flooding corridors. The smoke was tinged with panic. By evening, the first attempts at escape began. A group of miners tried to dig their way out through an old shaft on the eastern side, hoping to emerge far from Lannister guards. But Tywin had anticipated this. Every old shaft, every forgotten exit had been located and watched. The Reynes who emerged were captured immediately. The captured miners told their captors what was happening below. The water was rising steadily, flooding the lower levels first. People were retreating upward, carrying what they could, cramming into the upper chambers. But there was nowhere to go. The water followed them up, level by level, filling the chambers they had fled. On the second day, a larger group tried to force their way out through the main entrance. Perhaps 50 men, armed and desperate, hoping to fight their way through the Lannister lines and scatter into the countryside. They emerged into bright daylight after days in the dark, blinking and disoriented, and ran directly into a prepared force 3 times their number. Lord Roger Reyne was among them. The Red Lion, who had laughed at Tytos Lannister's weakness, who had openly mocked the Lannisters for a generation, who had believed his underground fortress made him invulnerable. He fought well, Lyman heard later, killed 3 Lannister men before he was overwhelmed. They brought him before Tywin in chains, water still dripping from his clothes, his face a mask of rage and desperation. "You cannot do this," Roger Reyne snarled, "despite the chains, despite everything. We are not small folk to be slaughtered like animals. We are nobility. There are laws, customs. There are oaths. Tywin interrupted, his voice cutting through Reyne's protests like a blade through silk. "Oaths you swore and broke. Oaths your house violated for 20 years. You speak of laws to me? You who made yourself outlaw through defiance? My children are down there, innocents who are dying because of your choices. Not mine, yours." Tywin leaned forward slightly. "You had every opportunity to be loyal. You chose mockery. You had every chance to pay your debts. You chose defiance. You had countless moments to bend the knee and remember your place. You chose pride. And now you will watch your house drown because of those choices." "Monster," Roger Reyne spat. "History will remember you as a monster. History will remember me as the man who restored House Lannister's honor. Your fate will be a footnote, a cautionary tale parents tell their children, the Rains of Castamere, they'll call it. And every time someone hears that song, they will remember what happens when you defy the lion." Tywin gestured to the guards. "Take him where he can see the mine entrance. Let him watch the water flow. Let him hear his family die. And when the last scream fades, then you may hang him." They did exactly that. Lyman didn't witness it personally. He could not bring himself to watch, but the reports were clear. Roger Reyne was forced to stand in sight of the main entrance as the water continued to flow, as the desperate attempts at escape grew fewer and more frantic, as the screams from below grew distant and then silent. The flooding took 3 days to complete. 3 days during which the Lannister army maintained its positions, capturing anyone who managed to emerge, watching the smoke from the air shafts gradually die away, listening to the sounds from below grow quieter and quieter, until there was only the rush of water and the silence of stone. On the 4th day, the engineers declared that all 9 levels were fully flooded. Castamere was now a tomb holding water instead of air, a monument to defiance answered with absolute consequence. The final count, compiled from the few prisoners taken and the records seized from Castamere Keep, suggested that over 300 people had been in the underground fortress when the flooding began. Men, women, children, servants, guards, all of House Reyne, and all who served them, all drowned in the dark beneath the earth. Tywin ordered Castamere Keep demolished, just as he had ordered Tarbeck Hall burned. The modest surface castle was torn down stone by stone, the rubble used to seal the mine entrances permanently. Within a week, nothing remained but bare ground and the sound of water flowing through hidden channels beneath. A bard had been travelling with the army, hired by one of the lords, hoping to compose a song about glorious battle. Instead, he wrote something else entirely. Lyman heard him singing it one night around the campfire, and the words made his blood run cold. "And who are you," the proud lord said, "that I must bow so low? Only a cat of a different coat, that's all the truth I know. In a coat of gold, or a coat of red, a lion still has claws. And mine are long and sharp, my lord, as long and sharp as yours." And so he spoke, that lord of Castamere. But now the Rains weep o'er his hall, with no one there to hear. Yes, now the Rains weep o'er his hall, and not a soul to hear. The song spread through the army that night, and by the next morning, everyone was singing it. The Rains of Castamere. A song that would outlive everyone present, that would be sung in every corner of Westeros as a reminder of this moment. Tywin heard the song, and did not order it stopped. If anything, Lyman thought he saw the faintest hint of satisfaction cross his lord's face. This was exactly what he wanted. Not just the destruction of the Rains, but the memory of that destruction. preserved in song and story, a permanent warning to anyone who might consider defiance. The army prepared to return to Casterly Rock. The campaign was over. House Reyne was extinct. House Tarbeck was extinct. The Westerlands had learned its lesson in blood and drowning and ash. And Tywin Lannister, at age 27, had transformed himself from a young lord trying to restore his house's honour into something else entirely. Something feared. Something absolute. Something that would shape the Seven Kingdoms for the next 30 years, until that same ruthless certainty would create the enemies that would finally destroy him. But that was still far in the future. For now, the rains had fallen on Castamere, and the lesson was complete. The army returned to Casterly Rock in triumph, though triumph seemed too cheerful a word for what they had accomplished. There were no celebrations, no victory feasts, no songs of glory sung in the great hall. The soldiers marched home in disciplined silence, carrying with them the weight of what they had witnessed. Lyman rode with the baggage train, his ledgers carefully packed, his records complete. He had documented everything, every bushel of grain consumed, every arrow loose, every death inflicted. The mathematics of extinction, rendered in neat columns that would be filed away in the archives of Casterly Rock, evidence of the most thorough campaign of annihilation the Westerlands had seen in generations. The common folk who watched the army's return did not cheer, but neither did they seem afraid. Instead, Lyman saw something else in their faces, a kind of grim satisfaction, perhaps even relief. The chaos was over. The defiance that had plagued the Westerlands for 20 years had been answered. Order had been restored, and if the price was steep, well, it was a price paid by those who had chosen to break their oaths. The small folk understood the logic, even if they did not entirely approve of the methods. Word of the Reyne Tarbeck destruction had spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms with remarkable speed. Ravens flew from keep to keep carrying the news, and with each retelling the story grew more terrible and more clear. Lord Tywin Lannister had exterminated 2 ancient houses for the crime of defiance. He had burned Tarbeck Hall to ash. He had drowned Castamere and everyone in it. And he had done all of this methodically, without anger, without mercy, with the cold efficiency of a man solving a mathematical problem. The reactions varied by region and house. In the north, Lord Rickard Stark was reported to have nodded approvingly, and remarked that southern lords had finally remembered what oaths meant. In the Reach, the Tyrells sent carefully worded congratulations that praised Tywin's restoration of order, while subtly distancing themselves from his methods. In Dorne, Prince Quentyn Martell observed that the young Lion of Lannister had proven he had teeth, and suggested that perhaps the other kingdoms should remember their own oaths to the Iron Throne. Even in the Vale and the Stormlands, lords who had no direct connection to Westerlands politics took note. A new power had emerged, young, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless. But it was in the Westerlands itself that the transformation was most apparent. Within weeks of Tywin's return, ravens arrived at Casterly Rock from every corner of the region. Houses that had ignored Lannister summons for years suddenly appeared with their full retinues, eager to demonstrate loyalty. Debts that had been conveniently forgotten for decades were paid in full, with interest. Lords who had treated Tytos Lannister's requests as suggestions now treated Tywin's slightest preference as divine command. Lyman watched this transformation from his position in the administrative offices. He saw the treasure flowing into Lannister coffers, Gold that had been owed for so long it had seemed mythical, suddenly materialized as real weight and coin. He documented the oaths renewed, the pledges made, the elaborate demonstrations of submission from houses that had spent years treating Casterly Rock with casual contempt. Fear, Lyman realized, was extraordinarily efficient. His lord had spent 6 weeks and the lives of several hundred people to establish a reputation that would save decades of argument, negotiation, and conflict. Every debt that was now paid without protest, every summons answered immediately, every order obeyed without question, all of this represented time and resources saved, conflicts avoided, authority established. The Reyne Tarbeck campaign had been expensive in blood, but it was proving remarkably cost-effective in governance. Tywin himself seemed unsurprised by any of this. He received the pledges of loyalty with the same flat expression he used for everything else, acknowledged the payments with brief nods, and made clear through his manner that this was not a restoration of his authority, but merely a recognition of authority that had always existed. He did not gloat, he did not threaten, he simply governed, and the Westerlands obeyed. 6 weeks after his return, Tywin prepared to ride back to King's Landing and resume his duties as Hand of the King. Aerys had been patient, more patient than many expected, given his growing reputation for impatience. But the realm needed its hand, and Tywin's leave of absence couldn't continue indefinitely. The night before his departure, Tywin summoned Lyman to his solar. The clerk arrived with his usual materials, expecting to receive instructions about managing Casterly Rock's affairs during his lord's absence. Instead, he found Tywin standing by the window, looking out over Lannisport, a cup of wine in his hand, the first time Lyman had ever seen him drink while working. "Sit," Tywin said without turning from the window. Lyman sat, uncertain what was expected of him. "You have been keeping records," Tywin continued, "very detailed records of everything that occurred during the campaign. Why? You instructed me to document all expenditures, and I instructed you to track supplies and logistics. You documented far more than that. I have seen your notes. You recorded conversations, observations, details that have no bearing on grain consumption or arrow counts. Why?" Lyman chose his words carefully. I thought that what we were doing was significant, my lord. That it would be important to have an accurate record, not just of the costs, but of the reasons, the methods, the lessons learned." "And what lessons did you learn, Lyman?" It was the second time Tywin had asked for his opinion, and once again the question was unexpected enough that Lyman answered honestly instead of cautiously. That power without the will to use it is not power at all. That mercy shown to the defiant is cruelty to the loyal. That reputation can be as much a weapon as swords or siege engines. He paused. "And that you are perhaps the most terrifying man I have ever known, my lord, because you understand all of this and feel no guilt about it." Tywin turned from the window to look at him directly, and for the first time something that might have been amusing touched his features. Guilt is what failures feel when they reflect on their mistakes. I do not make mistakes. He took a drink of his wine. "Do you think I'm a monster, Lyman? Be honest." "I think you are necessary, my lord. I think the Westerlands needed what you did, even if it was terrible. I think your father's kindness was destroying House Lannister, and your cruelty has saved it." Lyman met his lord's gaze. "But I also think that what works in the Westerlands may not work everywhere. Fear is a powerful tool, but it is also a dangerous one. It can turn allies into enemies. It can create the very rebellions Taas seeks to prevent. You believe I went too far. I believe you went exactly as far as you needed to go for this situation. But I wonder what happens when the next situation requires a different approach, and all anyone knows of you is Castamere. Tywin was quiet for a long moment, studying the clerk who had somehow become a confidant. When he spoke again, his voice carried something Lyman had never heard before. Not quite uncertainty, but perhaps consideration. My father believed that if he was kind enough, patient enough, understanding enough, people would naturally respond with loyalty and respect. He was wrong. People, lords especially, respond to incentives. Fear of consequences is an incentive. Respect for power is an incentive. Hope for reward can be an incentive, but only if the fear of punishment is also present. Without that fear, hope becomes presumption, and presumption becomes defiance. He set down his wine cup and walked to his desk, where a stack of letters waited. Correspondence from across the 7 kingdoms. You are right that fear is dangerous. But do you know what is more dangerous? Inconsistency, unpredictability. When people cannot trust that you will keep your word, whether that word is a promise or a threat, they begin to test you constantly, probing for weakness, measuring their own advantages. My father's greatest failing was not that he lacked the will to punish defiance. It was that he sometimes punished it and sometimes forgave it, and no one could predict which response they would receive. That inconsistency invited constant testing. Tywin picked up one of the letters. This is from Lord Tyrell. He congratulates me on restoring order, while subtly suggesting that I might have achieved the same result through negotiation and compromise. He is wrong, but his wrongness is instructive. Men like Tyrell believe in the power of words, of agreements, of honor as an abstract concept. They do not understand that honor only matters when backed by consequence. A promise means nothing if everyone knows you will not enforce it. An oath means nothing if breaking it carries no penalty. He set the letter down and picked up another. This is from the Citadel, an archmaester writing to express concern about the precedent set by Castamere, the extinction of noble houses, the killing of women and children. He speaks eloquently about the laws of gods and men, about the traditions that govern warfare between nobility. He reminds me that even the Targaryens, for all their dragons, typically allowed defeated enemies to bend the knee and survive. And what will you tell him, my lord? Nothing. Archmaesters write letters. I govern the Westerlands. His concern is noted and irrelevant. Tywin's voice hardened slightly. But his letter reveals the problem I will face going forward. Many will see Castamere as evidence of cruelty rather than necessity. They will tell themselves that I am vicious, unstable, dangerous. Some will fear me. So much they will consider preemptive action against me. The reputation I have built will be both shield and target. He looked at Lyman directly. This is why I value you honestly. You see both the utility and the danger. You understand that what I did was necessary, while also recognizing that necessity has costs beyond gold and lives. That balance of vision is rare. Tywin returned to the window, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been vulnerability, though Lyman would never have dared use that word. My wife understands as well. Joanna. Have you met her? Briefly, my lord, when she was last at Casterly Rock. She was in Lannisport when I returned from Castamere. She looked at me, and I could see in her eyes that she knew, not just what I had done, but what it meant, what it would cost, and she stood beside me anyway. Tywin was silent for a moment. She is the only person whose judgment I truly value. She does not fear me, but she does not coddle me either. She sees me clearly and chooses to remain. That is rare. Lyman said nothing. This was the most personal Tywin had ever been, and he sensed that his lord needed silence more than response. "She is with child," Tywin continued, still looking out the window. "Our first. A son, I hope, though a daughter would not disappoint. Someone to inherit what I am building. Someone who will never know the shame I felt watching my father be mocked and humiliated. Someone who will grow up understanding that Lannister means something, means power, respect, fear when necessary, and loyalty when deserved." He turned back to face Lyman. "I am telling you this because you have earned my trust through your discretion and competence. You will remain here at Casterly Rock while I am in King's Landing. You will continue your work, not just the accounts, but the observations. I want to know everything that happens in the Westerlands, every oath renewed, every payment made, every whisper of discontent. You will be my eyes in the west, while I serve the king in the east." "I am honored, my lord." "You are useful. That is better than being honored." Tywin's voice returned to its normal flat certainty. "The Westerlands must remain stable. What I built with Castamere must be maintained. Fear is like a blade. It must be sharpened regularly, or it dulls. I do not expect to drown another house, but I expect every lord in the West to remember that I could, if they gave me reason. That memory, that possibility, is what keeps order." He gestured to the door. "You may go. Prepare whatever you need for my departure tomorrow. And Lyman, destroy your detailed notes of the campaign. The official records showing supplies and costs may remain, but your observations about conversations and methods should not exist in writing. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve." Lyman bowed and left, understanding the instruction perfectly. The full truth of Castamere, the calculations, the deliberate choices, the cold efficiency of planned extinction, that was knowledge that could be used against Tywin. Better to let legend and song carry the story, where truth and myth could blur together into something more useful than mere fact. He burned his notes that night, watching years of careful observation turn to ash. But he did not need the notes to remember. Everything was written in his mind. The gallows, the burning castle, the water flowing into Castamere, Lord Roger Reyne's face when he realized his house was drowning. These images would stay with him forever, a private archive of the moment when the Westerlands learned what it meant to defy a Lannister. Tywin departed for King's Landing the next morning with an appropriate ceremony. The lords of the Westerlands gathered to see him off, and the contrast with his father's send-offs was profound. When Tytos had travelled, men had smiled and joked and treated it as a social occasion. When Tywin travelled, men stood in neat ranks, silent and respectful, their eyes acknowledging a lord who commanded not just wealth, but absolute authority. The months that followed demonstrated the lasting effectiveness of the Castamere lesson. The Westerlands remained stable in Tywin's absence, not the false stability of his father's reign, where order was maintained only because no one bothered to test it seriously, but true stability built on certain consequences. Disputes between bannermen were brought to Casterly Rock's appointed administrators and settled according to law. Taxes were paid on time. Summons were answered. The machinery of governance operated smoothly because everyone understood that defiance meant destruction. Lyman compiled monthly reports for Tywin, documenting this new order. But he also noted subtler changes. The bards who travelled through the Westerlands all sang the Rains of Castamere. Now, it had become the unofficial anthem of Lannister power. Children in Lannisport played games where some pretended to be Lannisters and others were rebellious houses, and the games always ended the same way, with the rebels defeated and destroyed. The lesson had penetrated deep into the culture, becoming part of how people understood the world. But Lyman also noticed signs of the danger he had warned Tywin about. Some lords obeyed not from loyalty, but from fear, and fear without respect was unstable. These lords did everything required of them, but there was no warmth in their service, no genuine connection to House Lannister beyond the calculation that defiance meant death. They were controlled, not loyal, and Lyman wondered what would happen if Tywin's power ever weakened, if the certainty of consequences ever wavered. In King's Landing, Tywin continued to excel as Hand of the King. The reports that reached Casterly Rock told of a realm well governed, of finances stabilized, of laws enforced. King Aerys was pleased with his hand, at first. But other letters, from more discreet sources, hinted at complications. Aerys was young and proud, and having such a capable hand meant that everyone praised Tywin while treating the king as almost secondary. The dynamic that worked when both were young friends was becoming strained as Aerys realized that his authority was overshadowed by his servants' competence. Lyman filed these reports carefully, noting the patterns. Tywin had solved the problem of defiant vassals through overwhelming force and lasting terror. But he was creating a different problem with his king, the problem of being too competent, too necessary, too obviously superior to the man he was meant to serve. That was a problem that could not be solved with swords or drowning. That required political delicacy, which was not Tywin's strength. 2 years after Castamere, Lady Joanna gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Cersei and Jaime, golden-haired and beautiful, the perfect children for the perfect Lannister lord. Tywin returned to Casterly Rock for the birth and stayed for 3 months, and Lyman saw a side of his lord that few others witnessed. With his children, Tywin was not quite warm. That was beyond him. But he was present, attentive, already planning their futures with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. Jaime will be a knight, Tywin told Lyman one evening, watching the infant son sleep. The finest knight in the realm, strong, skilled, honourable in the way that inspires loyalty. He will be everything a Lannister should be, powerful and respected, feared by enemies and valued by friends. And Lady Cersei, my lord? She will be a queen. I can see it already. Her intelligence, her will, her beauty. She will marry a king or a great lord, and through her, House Lannister will be tied to the highest powers in the realm. Tywin's voice carried absolute certainty. My children will restore everything my father nearly destroyed. They will make the name Lannister synonymous with excellence. Lyman said nothing, but he thought about the weight Tywin was already placing on infants barely months old. These children would grow up under enormous expectations, shaped by a father who understood power, but perhaps not love, who could plan dynasties but might struggle with the simple act of holding his children without calculating their future value. When Tywin returned to King's Landing, he left with his family in better order than it had been in generations. The Westerlands were stable and profitable. His children were healthy and promising. His reputation was established. By every measure that mattered to him, he had succeeded in reversing his father's failures and establishing House Lannister as a force to be reckoned with. But success, Lyman was learning, created its own problems. The same ruthlessness that had solved the Reyne Tarbeck crisis was being applied to everything. To governance, to relationships, to his children's futures. Tywin had learned one lesson from his father's reign, that mercy was weakness and fear was strength. But perhaps that was not the only lesson available. Perhaps there were other ways to build loyalty beyond threatening destruction, other ways to govern beyond calculated terror. 3 years after Castamere, another child was born to Tywin and Joanna, a son, born malformed, a dwarf. Tyrion Lannister entered the world, and his mother died, bringing him into it. The tragedy that struck House Lannister that day would echo through the decades that followed, shaping choices and relationships in ways that no one could fully predict. Lyman received word of it in Casterly Rock, and felt his heart sink. Joanna had been the one person who could see Tywin clearly and still care for him, the one person whose judgment he valued, the one person who might have softened the hardness that Castamere had created. Now she was gone, and in her place was a malformed child whom Tywin would always associate with her death. The reports from King's Landing grew darker. Tywin retreated further into himself, becoming colder, harder. The grief he felt, and he must have felt grief, even if he never showed it, transformed into anger, and that anger had nowhere to go except toward the child who had cost him his wife. Tyrion grew up under the weight of his father's hatred, shaped by rejection the way Tywin had been shaped by humiliation. And so the cycle continued. Tywin had learned from Tytos's failures and overcorrected, becoming so hard that he could not bend. And his son Tyrion would learn different lessons from Tywin's hardship. Lessons about rejection and survival, and the ways that unloved children find their own paths through the world. Lyman watched all of this from his position at Casterly Rock, documenting, observing, understanding. He saw the pattern clearly, the lesson learned at Castamere, that fear and ruthlessness were the only reliable tools of power, had saved House Lannister's authority in the Westerlands. But that same lesson, applied without modification to every aspect of life, was poisoning the personal relationships that should have been Tywin's greatest strength. His children grew up terrified of disappointing him. His bannermen obeyed from fear rather than love. His king began to resent him. And when his wife died, he had no one left who could tell him that there were other ways to be strong, other tools besides fear and consequence. The Westerlands remained stable. The debts remained paid. The oaths remained honoured. By every objective measure, Tywin's governance was a success. But Lyman could see the cracks forming, not in the structure of power, but in the human relationships that should have supported it. The lord who had drowned an entire house to teach a lesson had not learned the complementary lesson, that power without human connection is brittle, that fear without respect is unstable, that the ruthlessness that wins wars does not always win hearts. These thoughts Lyman kept to himself. He was a clerk, not a counsellor. He documented and observed, but did not advise. And besides, who was he to question Lord Tywin Lannister, the man who had restored his house's honour, who governed the richest region in Westeros with iron efficiency, who had transformed himself from a humiliated youth into the most feared lord in the realm. But sometimes, late at night, Lyman would remember Lord Tytos, weak, kind, ultimately ineffective Tytos, and wonder if perhaps there had been something worth preserving in that kindness, some balance between Tytos's excessive mercy and Tywin's absolute ruthlessness, some middle path that combined strength with humanity, that enforced consequences while still maintaining genuine relationships. That path, if it existed, Tywin Lannister had not found. He had chosen clarity over nuance, fear over love, power over connection. And for now, at this moment, that choice was working. The Westerlands prospered under his firm hand. His reputation kept the peace more effectively than armies could. But Lyman had learned his own lesson from Castamere, that every solution creates new problems, that every victory carries hidden costs, and that the seeds of destruction are often planted in the very moments of greatest triumph. The rains had fallen on Castamere. The lesson had been taught, and Tywin Lannister had become exactly what he needed to become to save his house from the weakness that had nearly destroyed it. Whether that transformation would ultimately save House Lannister or doom, it remained to be seen. That answer would take decades to emerge, would require a full accounting of all the choices made and all the relationships destroyed in the name of restored honor. But for now, the gold and the lion stood supreme, and the song of the rains played on, a reminder to all who heard it. This is what it means to defy a Lannister. This is the price of challenging the lion. Fear us, obey us, and never, ever forget what happened to those who tried to stand against us. That was the lesson of Castamere, and it was a lesson the Seven Kingdoms would remember for generations. 20 years after the rains fell on Castamere, Lyman was an old man. His hair had gone white, his hands had developed the tremor that comes with age, and his eyes required spectacles for the detailed work that had defined his life. But his mind remained sharp, and his position at Casterly Rock had evolved from simple clerk to something closer to historian, the keeper of records, the man who remembered everything, the living archive of House Lannister's transformation. He sat in his small office, surrounded by ledgers that spanned decades, and reflected on what had become of the lesson taught in Blood and Water all those years ago. The Westerlands remained stable, perhaps the most stable region in all the Seven Kingdoms. The debts were still paid, the oaths were still honoured. The machinery of Lannister governance still operated with mechanical precision. By every measure that Lord Tywin valued, the campaign against the Reynes and Tarbecks had been an unqualified success. But Lyman had learned to measure success differently over the years. He had watched the unintended consequences unfold slowly, like a poison working its way through a body, not killing immediately, but weakening, corrupting, transforming. The lesson of Castamere had saved House Lannister's authority, yes, but it had also created something else, something harder to quantify in ledgers and accounts. The song had spread, exactly as Tywin had intended. The Rains of Castamere was sung in taverns from Dorney to the Wall, taught to children alongside their letters, hummed by small folk at their work. Everyone knew the story. Everyone understood the message. Challenge the Lannisters and die. Defy the lion and drown. The reputation had been established so thoroughly that it had become part of the cultural landscape of Westeros, as permanent as the mountains themselves, and that reputation had served its purpose. When Tywin spoke, men listened. When he made demands, they were met. When he entered a room, silence fell and heads bowed. He had become perhaps the most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms who did not wear a crown. Hand of the king for 20 years, ruling the realm while Aerys descended into the madness that would eventually consume him. But power, Lyman had observed, was not the same as wisdom. And fear, however effective, was not the same as loyalty. The relationship between Tywin and King Aerys had deteriorated exactly as Lyman had predicted all those years ago. The king had grown to resent his too capable hand, the man who governed so effectively that everyone knew the realm ran on Tywin's competence rather than Aerys's authority. The friendship of youth had curdled into something toxic, Aerys's jealousy feeding on Tywin's success, creating a dynamic that grew more poisonous each year. The breaking point had come 5 years earlier, when Aerys had named Jaime Lannister to the Kingsguard. On the surface, it was a great honour, the king personally selecting Tywin's heir for the most prestigious military order in the realm. But everyone understood the true meaning. By placing Jaime in the Kingsguard, Aerys had stolen Tywin's heir, ensuring that the golden son who was supposed to inherit Casterly Rock and continue the Lannister dynasty would instead serve the crown in celibacy, never fathering children, never ruling the Westerlands. It was an insult dressed as an honour, and Tywin had resigned as Hand immediately. The man who had drowned an entire house for defiance could not directly punish a king, so he had done the only thing available to him, withdrawn his service and returned to Casterly Rock, leaving Aerys to govern without the competence that had propped up his reign for 2 decades. Lyman had been present when Tywin returned from King's Landing, his face showing the same flat expression it always showed, but his eyes carrying a fury that had nowhere to go. The lesson of Castamere had taught Tywin that defiance must be crushed completely, but what did you do when the defiance came from the king himself? When the man who insulted you was the one person you couldn't destroy without committing treason? The answer, it seemed, was to retreat and wait. To govern the Westerlands with the same iron efficiency, while the realm beyond descended into chaos under Aerys's increasingly erratic rule. To watch and calculate and plan for whatever opportunities might emerge from the king's madness. And in the meantime, to face the consequences of choices made 20 years earlier. Consequences that were now reaching their full bloom in the relationships closest to home. Tywin's children had grown into exactly what he had planned, and exactly what he had feared. Jaime was indeed a brilliant knight, strong, skilled, handsome, seemingly perfect in every way. But he was now sworn to a mad king, his future stolen, his potential as Lannister heir erased by a jealous monarch's spite. The Golden Sun was now a white cloak, and Tywin's dynasty plans had been destroyed. Cersei had grown into extraordinary beauty and fierce intelligence, exactly as Tywin had predicted. He had indeed tried to make her a queen, had proposed a match between her and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne. But Aerys, in another calculated insult to his former hand, had rejected the proposal with barely concealed contempt. Cersei remained unmarried, growing bitter in Casterly Rock, watching her beauty and her prime years slip away while her father's enemies denied her the throne she had been raised to claim. And Tyrion. Lyman sighed, thinking of the youngest Lannister child. Tyrion had grown into a clever, sharp-minded young man, cursed with a malformed body, and a father who had never forgiven him for costing Joanna her life. Tywin's treatment of his dwarf son was perhaps the clearest evidence that the lesson of Castamere, that fear and ruthlessness solved all problems, had its limits. You could drown a rebellious house. You could not drown your own son, no matter how much you might wish to. You could only hate him, publicly shame him, and ensure that everyone knew he was a disappointment to House Lannister. The cruelty that had worked so effectively against the Reynes and Tarbecks had turned inward, poisoning Tywin's own family. His children had grown up under impossible expectations, shaped by a father who measured love in terms of utility and saw affection as weakness. They were brilliant and damaged in equal measure. Jaime trapped in White, Cersei trapped in Casterly Rock, Tyrion trapped in his own body and his father's contempt. Lyman had watched it all unfold and documented what he could. He saw the pattern clearly now. The same qualities that made Tywin an effective lord, the ruthlessness, the emotional distance, the refusal to show weakness or vulnerability, made him a terrible father. He had saved House Lannister's reputation and destroyed his own children's happiness. The gold and the lion stood strong, but the human beings who carried those symbols were deeply wounded. And then there were the broader consequences, the ways that Castamere had shaped not just House Lannister, but the realm itself. Other lords had learned from Tywin's example, but they had learned different lessons than he intended. Some saw Castamere and understood only brutality, without the careful calculation that had made it effective. They crushed their own rebellions with excessive force and created more enemies than they solved. Others saw Castamere and became too cautious, too afraid of Lannister power, creating a dynamic where fear prevented honest counsel and produced sycophants instead of allies. The song The Rains of Castamere had become something more than Tywin intended. Yes, it warned against defying the Lannisters, but it also created an expectation that every insult, every slight, every challenge would be met with total destruction. Tywin could not afford to show weakness now, could not afford to compromise or negotiate, because everyone expected him to respond to defiance the way he had responded to the Reynes and Tarbecks. The reputation that protected him also imprisoned him. Lyman thought about the prisoners at Tarbeck Hall, the 73 men hanged for following their lord's commands. He thought about the children who drowned at Castamere, guilty of nothing but bearing the Reyne name. He thought about Lord Roger Reyne being forced to watch his house die before his own execution. These images had never left him, would never leave him. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether there had been another way. Could Tywin have restored Lannister authority without complete extermination? Could he have crushed the rebellion, executed the leaders, and shown mercy to the followers? Could he have burned Tarbeck Hall, but allowed the Tarbecks themselves to survive in disgrace? Could he have flooded Castamere, but given the Reynes a chance to flee? Perhaps, but perhaps not. Lyman had lived through Tytos's reign, had seen how partial measures and inconsistent enforcement created the very defiance that Tywin had to answer. Half measures might have invited further challenges. Mercy might have been interpreted as weakness. The lesson might not have been learned thoroughly enough to prevent future rebellions. And yet, the cost of thoroughness had been so high, not just in lives, though the death toll was significant, but in what it had done to Tywin himself, to his capacity for human connection, to his relationships with his own children. The truth, Lyman had come to believe, was that there were no perfect answers. Titus's excessive mercy had nearly destroyed House Lannister. Tywin's excessive ruthlessness had saved the house, but damaged the family. The ideal would have been some balance between the two, strength tempered with humanity, consequences enforced but proportionate, fear backed by respect, rather than standing alone. But finding that balance required wisdom that perhaps no one possessed, and Tywin Lannister, for all his brilliance, was not wise. He was brilliant, calculating, effective, but not wise. He saw the world in terms of power and consequence, threat and response, strength and weakness. The nuances between these extremes, the complexity of human motivation and relationship, these were beyond his vision. A knock at Lyman's door interrupted his reflections. A young servant entered, one of the newer ones who did not remember the old days, who knew Lord Tywin only as the fearsome lord who ruled Casterly Rock with absolute authority. "My Lord Tywin requests your presence in his solar," the servant said, his voice carefully neutral. Lyman stood slowly, his old bones protesting. He gathered his materials, not the full ledgers, just his current notes and observations, and made his way through the familiar corridors of Casterly Rock. After 40 years of service, he knew every turn, every stairway, every hidden corner of this great fortress. He found Tywin at his desk, reading correspondence, his face showing the same expression it had shown for decades. The man was in his 50s now, his golden hair beginning to show threads of grey, but he remained formidable, straight-backed, clear-eyed, radiating the authority that had become his defining characteristic. "Sit," Tywin said, without looking up from his letter. Lyman sat and waited. This was how Tywin worked. Silence until he was ready to speak. No wasted words. No unnecessary pleasantries. Finally, Tywin set down the letter and looked at him. "You have been keeping records for 40 years. You were present at Castamere. You have observed everything that followed. I want your honest assessment. Was it worth it?" The question surprised Lyman, though at his age few things truly surprised him any more. Tywin rarely asked for assessments of past decisions. He made choices and moved forward, never looking back, never second-guessing. That he was asking now suggested something had changed. "Worth it in what sense, my lord?" "In every sense. The campaign cost lives, gold, and created enemies. It established a reputation that has served us well, but also constrained our options. It solved the immediate problem of defiant vassals, but may have created longer-term complications. Was the trade worth making?" Lyman thought carefully before answering. This might be his last chance to speak truth to power, to share observations that decades of discretion had kept silent. "For the Westerlands, yes. The stability you created has endured. The debts are paid, the oaths honoured, the peace maintained. By that measure, Castamere was absolutely worth it. And by other measures? For your family. I am less certain, my lord." Lyman chose his words carefully. "The same ruthlessness that crushed the Reynes has shaped how you relate to your children. They fear disappointing you more than they hope to please you. That fear has made them strong in some ways, but it has also damaged them." Tywin's expression did not change. "They are Lannisters. Strength is what matters." "Forgive me, my lord, but I have watched them grow. Lady Cersei is brilliant but bitter. Sir Jaime is trapped in a position that wastes his potential. And Lord Tyrion—" Lyman trailed off, uncertain how far he could push. "Say it." "Lord Tyrion might have been an asset to the house if you had treated him as a son, rather than a reminder of your wife's death. His mind is as sharp as yours. perhaps sharper. But your contempt has driven him to spite, rebellion, and choices that harm House Lannister's interests." Tywin was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something Lyman had rarely heard. Not quite uncertainty, but perhaps acknowledgement. "You believe I should have been softer, more like my father." "No, my lord, your father's softness nearly destroyed the house, but there is territory between Titus's excessive mercy and your absolute ruthlessness. Your father loved too freely and enforced too little. You enforce absolutely, but love not at all. Neither extreme is ideal. Love is not a tool of governance. No, my lord, but it is a tool of the family. And a great house is both a political entity and a family. You have mastered the political side while damaging the familial side. That damage may cost House Lannister dearly in the future." Tywin stood and walked to the window, the same window where he had stood 40 years earlier, looking out over Lannisport, planning the destruction of the Reynes and Tarbecks. Lyman wondered if he was remembering that conversation, if he recalled the younger man he had been, the choices he had made, the path he had chosen. "The realm is changing," Tywin said finally. "Aerys grows madder each day. His son Rogar is a fool who reads too many prophecies. The stability we have known for decades is crumbling. War is coming. I can feel it approaching, like a storm on the horizon." He turned to face Lyman. "When that war comes, the reputation built at Castamere will be crucial. Men will ally with us or against us based on what they remember about that song, about what happens to those who defy the lion. The fear will matter. The ruthlessness will matter. Whatever personal costs I have paid, whatever damage to family relationships, these will be irrelevant compared to whether House Lannister survives the coming chaos." "Perhaps, my lord. But consider this. When the war comes, you will need not just fearful allies, but loyal ones. You will need people who serve House Lannister from genuine commitment, not just terror of consequences. Fear makes men obedient, but it does not make them brave. It does not inspire them to sacrifice for your cause. Love does that. Respect does that. And those qualities you have not cultivated." Tywin's jaw tightened. "You speak beyond your station." "You asked for an honest assessment, my lord. After 40 years, I thought I had earned the right to provide it." The tension stretched between them. Lyman half expected to be dismissed, perhaps even punished for his bluntness. But then Tywin did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a short, bitter sound, nothing like genuine mirth, but it was laughter nonetheless. "You have indeed earned that right, and you may even be correct." He returned to his desk and sat heavily. "But the choices were made long ago. I cannot unmake Castamere. I cannot restore the Reynes and Tarbecks to life. I cannot become my father, even if I wish to. The path was chosen, and I have walked it to its end. Now I must live with the consequences and hope that the benefits outweigh the costs. There is still time, my lord, to change how you relate to your children, to show them that strength can include affection, that authority does not require emotional distance. They are grown now. The damage, as you call it, is done. Children are never too old to learn new lessons from their father." Tywin shook his head. "You do not understand. The lesson of Castamere was not just for the Westerlands. It was for me as well. I learned that day that sentiment is weakness, that mercy invites defiance, that only fear and consequence create lasting order. I cannot unlearn that lesson without undoing everything I have built." And there it was, Lyman realized. The fundamental truth that explained everything about Tywin Lannister. He had internalized the lesson of Castamere so completely that it had become inseparable from his identity. To question that lesson, to consider that it might have limits or costs, would be to question the very foundation of everything he had accomplished. And Tywin Lannister did not question himself. Then I fear for House Lannister's future, my lord. Not its immediate future. You have secured that admirably. But its longer future, after you are gone. What happens when your children inherit your power, but not your certainty? What happens when they try to rule, using only fear, without your calculating intelligence to guide it? They will learn, or they will fail. That is not my concern. I will be dead. With respect, my lord, that is precisely your concern. A lord's duty extends beyond his own lifetime. The choices you make shape your children, and their choices will shape the realm after you are gone. The seeds you plant today will bear fruit for generations. Tywin was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost contemplative. Do you know what I think about late at night, Lyman? When the work is done and the castle is silent? I think about my father, about the shame I felt, watching him be mocked and humiliated, about the determination I felt to never be like him, to never allow House Lannister to be weak again. He paused. And I wonder if my children feel about me what I felt about him, if they watch me and vow never to be like me, if I have become to them what he was to me, an example of what not to be. It was the most vulnerable statement Lyman had ever heard from Tywin Lannister, and he chose his response carefully. Your children do not see you as weak, my lord. They see you as hard. Too hard, perhaps, just as you saw your father as too soft. The ideal would be somewhere between these extremes, but finding that balance is perhaps the hardest thing any parent attempts. I have never attempted it. I have only replicated in reverse my father's failure. He loved too much and ruled too little. I rule absolutely and love not at all. It is not too late to... It is, Tywin interrupted with finality. The die is cast, the lesson is learned, and we will all live with the consequences. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Thank you for your honesty, Lyman. You have served House Lannister with distinction for 4 decades. When I am gone, you will be rewarded appropriately. Lyman bowed and left, understanding that this was as close to an admission of doubt or regret as Tywin Lannister would ever come. The man had spent 40 years building walls of emotional distance, reinforcing them with each choice, each sacrifice of human connection in favor of political advantage. Those walls were too thick to breach now, too fundamental to his sense of self to be torn down. As Lyman walked back to his office, he thought about the song. The Reynes of Castamere would outlive them all, outlive Tywin, outlive his children, outlive everyone who remembered the actual events. The song would carry the lesson forward through generations. This is what happens when you defy the Lannisters, fear them, obey them, and never forget. But the song would not carry the full truth. It would not preserve the nuances, the costs, the damage done to the family even as the house was saved. It would not record the children who grew up unloved, the relationships poisoned by ruthlessness, the humanity sacrificed for power. Those truths would die with the people who lived them, and perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps every generation needs to learn its own lessons, make its own mistakes, find its own balance between strength and mercy, fear and love, power and humanity. Lyman sat at his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment. He had been instructed decades ago to destroy his detailed observations, and he had obeyed. But now, at the end of his life, he felt compelled to record something. Not for official archives, not for Tywin to see, but for some future reader who might wonder about the true cost of Castamere. He wrote, "In the year 263 AC, Lord Tywin Lannister destroyed House Reyne and House Tarbeck for the crime of defiance. The campaign was militarily brilliant, politically effective, and strategically necessary. It restored House Lannister's authority and created a reputation that has endured for decades. But it also created a man so hardened by the necessity of ruthlessness that he could not unbend, could not soften, could not show love to his own children without fearing it would be interpreted as weakness. The same lesson that saved the house damaged the family. The same strength that crushed rebellion destroyed relationships. I do not know if there was a better way. Perhaps Lord Tytos's mercy and Lord Tywin's ruthlessness were two sides of the same error. The failure to find balance, to understand that different situations require different approaches, that wisdom lies in knowing when to be hard and when to be soft. What I do know is this: the rains of Castamere will be sung for generations. But the full truth, the price paid, the damage done, the humanity lost, that will be forgotten, and perhaps that is the greatest cost of all. Signed, Lyman, Clerk of Casterly Rock, 42nd year of service to House Lannister." He folded the parchment and placed it in his personal effects, to be found after his death by whoever sorted through his belongings. It was a small act of preservation, likely futile. But it felt important to record that someone had understood, someone had seen not just the victory, but the cost. Outside, the sun was setting over Lannisport, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Lannister colours bleeding across the horizon. Somewhere in the city below, a bard was probably singing "The Rains of Castamere" to an appreciative audience. The song played on, year after year, carrying its lesson of power and consequence. But what the song did not say, what it could never say, was this: every solution creates new problems, every victory carries hidden costs, and the seeds of House Lannister's eventual destruction were planted in the very moment of its greatest triumph, in the lessons learned at Castamere, in the hard shell that formed around Tywin's heart and never cracked open again. The rains had fallen, the lesson had been taught, and the price, the full price, in damaged relationships and poisoned love and children who learned to fear their father rather than trust him. That price was still being paid, would continue being paid for generations to come. That was the truth that the song did not carry. That was the price of gold and lions. And it was a price that Tywin Lannister, for all his calculating intelligence, had never properly accounted for in his careful ledgers. If you see Tywin differently now, understanding the fear that forged him, the costs his ruthlessness extracted, you're not alone. Was Castamere necessary, or did the lesson poison everything that followed? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you'd like more journeys through the blood-soaked history of Westeros, where songs hide darker truths, you know what to do.